Welcome. I'm Sara Wilmes, and this is my colleague, Siry. And we welcome you to this video where we will spend some time unpacking language-based frameworks relative to science education and science education research.
This is an overview of how we've structured this video. We've divided it up into 4 parts. And at the end of each of these 4 parts, we have reflective prompts that are built in. The first part we'll be talking about is who are we and what does language have to do with it? From there, we'll move into thinking about language communication and meaning making and the ways in which they're all connected. We'll try and deconstruct that a bit with thinking about our own research. We'll move into language and communication in particular as relevant for science education. And we'll close the video by thinking about ways in which we can make spaces for diverse voices in science education research. So we ask you at this point to take a moment to pause the video. Please go find something that you can use to document your reflections with, and then come back and press play, and we'll move into part A.
Part A, who are we as researchers and what does language have to do with it?
As a research scientist, I currently work with the SciTeach Center at the University of Luxembourg. In our project, we work with teachers who are plurilingual, who then teach science with plurilingual students. In this context, I'd say pretty much everything has to do with language, communication, and how those relate to science education. It kind of goes back to me and my fascination with language and communication and how students can engage in classrooms and then talk about or demonstrate their understanding to when I first moved to Luxembourg 11 years ago. I remember talking to someone at the university and saying, I'm really intrigued by this multilingual context. And they said to me, what do you mean? All students learn science in German. There's nothing interesting there. It's all the same. If all the students are learning in German, what is there to be interested in? And that really sparked a moment where I began to dissect, what is it about this context? What is it about what happens with these students? And really that's where my interest in communication in classrooms and the different modes that students employ when they communicate really blossomed.
So when I think of this question of who am I and what does language have to do with it, I move between 2 periods of time in my life. And one is around the time of 2009, which is when I came to Luxembourg. It's around when Sara came too. And at that point, I had never been in Luxembourg before. I didn't know any Luxembourgers. I moved here to accept a position as a postdoctoral researcher working in kindergarten classrooms, investigating children's science interactions. And I was really struck by the complexities, the communication complexities in these multilingual classrooms with these plurilingual young children. And at that point, I was kind of taken back in time to my own early childhood experiences. So I grew up in New York City as the only child of a divorced mom and my mom had recently relocated from Germany. And so I grew up speaking German in the home and learned English mostly in elementary school. And while I don't have necessarily a lot of present memories of this act of learning English, what I do remember as a child is a feeling of frustration and not being able to make myself clear, wanting to say something to teachers or to peers and just not being able to do it in a way that they could understand what I was trying to say. And that feeling, and it was a repeated feeling that I felt over and over again in school as a young child, that feeling stays really present with me and I think grounds a lot of my work here as I try to work together with teachers to create spaces for their students to be able to build on the many resources that they bring to school so that perhaps they're not positioned in ways to feel such frustration, but rather are positioned in ways to make their understandings and their questionings known by drawing on a whole range of resources.
And now we'd like to share with you a few insights into our research context in Luxembourg.
Luxembourg is a small country in Europe with a total population of just over 625,000 in 2020 and an area of just roughly 2,500 square kilometers. Despite its small size, Luxembourg has one of the highest population densities in Europe, coupled with one of the highest population growth rates in Europe. Luxembourg is a multilingual country with 2 official languages, French and German, and 1 national language, Luxembourgish. Adding to this complexity, Luxembourg has the highest density of non-national residents in Europe, as shown in this graph with data from 2014, with Luxembourg being that tall bar in the center. There are over 170 nationalities in Luxembourg, and this diversity is also reflected in the public schools, in which 49% of students hold nationalities other than Luxembourgish, and over 60% of students speak primary languages at home other than Luxembourgish, a trend which has been steadily increasing, as is represented in this graph, where dark blue indicates the percentage of students with Luxembourgish nationality, and light blue being those with other nationalities. This slide illustrates data regarding grade repetition in OECD countries, and Luxembourg has one of the highest percentages of students repeating at least 1 grade of school, with a large percentage of these students being students who do not speak the languages of instruction in the home. We now zoom into classes from several prior studies conducted within our team to try to illustrate some of the language complexities within this national context. This slide shows data regarding the linguistic repertoires of participating students in one secondary school class. Students' language repertoires are represented with an O for the languages spoken in the home and an X for languages spoken in other contexts. All participating students spoke between 3 and 7 languages. Of these students, 6 out of the 12 spoke one of the languages of instruction at the home. Important to note is that none of them spoke more than one of the curricular languages at home. We have used the drawing of language profiles with students as an approach to try to understand and illustrate the different ways in which the languages fit into their everyday and their own perspectives on how they use languages and these heteroglossic spaces in which they move through. So this is one example of a student, Sandra, who spoke 7 languages. And here we see the ways in which she described her drawing. So she says that she speaks German at school. And German, you can see on her sort of upper arm on the left-hand side of the photo. She speaks a little bit of English. That's the front on the left side of her hand. French is her francophone language, so she has that in the center, her heart and her core. And she speaks Portuguese with her boyfriend, so that's on her other arm. She's of Italian origin, so she also puts that as sort of her base. She speaks Luxembourgish at school, so she has that on one leg. And she speaks Cape Verdean with friends. That's a smaller part of the other leg, more of the foot of her interactions. So perhaps you can imagine some of the complexities in our classrooms. We have here, we've shown a small excerpt from a transcript that shows an interaction between a student named Paolo and his teacher, Miss W. And Paolo is trying to explain an observation that he had made during a science investigation to Miss Paolo, and she's trying to ask him questions to make his point clear. And so to begin to analyze an interaction such as the one between Paolo and Miss W, we use lots of different approaches, and that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about during our time together. This transcript comes from a study where we were looking first at the ways in which students were using languages in their interactions with each other and with their teachers around science investigations. So with that as a focus, then one of the first things that needs to be done with a transcript such as this one is to begin to, after transcription, begin to identify the different languages that are being used in the interactions. So here in this example, we've used blue to represent Luxembourgish and orange to represent German, which is the target language of instruction in the classroom. In this interaction, Paulo also uses Portuguese, which is colored in green here. And so this just begins to capture some of the complexities with a focus on the spoken resources used in interaction. And we commonly call these in our team our rainbow transcripts. And some of the transcripts might have very different colors depending on who the participants are in the interaction. This contextual complexity raises critical considerations for our work, and we are continually trying to reflexively think about the things that we're doing regarding our research and teacher education, but also regarding our collaborations with other science education programs and structures here nationally. And in reflecting on the complexity and in our role, and especially in reflecting it on the integral nature of the relationship between language and science, we find an obligation to unpack what all of this means relative to our work with teachers and with students and with their communities as we strive to work towards equitable and inclusive classrooms.
Reflective Pause Part A. Who are you? What is your linguistic context? We now invite you to engage with this reflective pause as a way to think about and synthesize the points we've mentioned relative to your own work. And so, A1, create your own linguistic profile. To do this, we invite you to create an outline of you. You may use this image here at the right, or you may use another. Use different colors to show on your outline the ways you talk and communicate with others. Be creative. Have fun with this. It's up to you how you represent the different languages that you use. C. Post your image of your linguistic profile on the Padlet link you see here. You may go to the Padlet and sign in as a guest, and then post your image. We'll look at our collective linguistic profiles when we meet together in the synchronous session. A2. What did you represent in your linguistic profile? A3. Think back over your life. In which contexts were the languages you included in your profile valued as resources? In which cases were they not valued? A4. What is the language context where you work and research? Jot down some notes and bring these with you when we meet during our synchronous session.
In this second part of our video, which we have titled Language, Communication, and Meaning Making, Drawn Out, Deconstructed, and Twisted, we will introduce some perspectives on language, communication, and meaning making in order to work towards developing some shared understandings of the role that language and communication can play in science education research and practice. The meaning and characteristics of language have long been the subject of intense debates in education research, and an important question to consider together at this point is, what is language? Why does it matter? What does it mediate? And relatedly, the question can be asked, what is communication? How does it happen? Why does it matter? Taking together these two questions can provide interesting points for reflection for you individually as well as for us collectively. We bring sociocultural perspectives to our work with children and teachers, and we embrace a variety of theories and methodologies to shine lights on the often unexpected and complex ways in which children interact with each other, with materials, and with their teachers. Learning, thinking, and knowing are relational and emergent from interaction in a process that is both individual as well as collective, one which is based on situated negotiation and renegotiation of meanings in the world and through experiences. And we situate science as cultural enactment, as embodied engagement. It is something that's done in interaction. And with these grounding perspectives, the projects that we engage in with our team share a focus on examining the dynamics and structures at play in science education, especially at the primary school levels, as we seek to reveal and highlight the many resources that children bring to their science education experiences, resources which can mediate the meanings that they make and express. In doing so, we work towards gaining new understandings on the embodied, collective, and profound ways in which children's resources serve to mediate their experiences in science education. We draw upon a range of theories and methodologies in our work, and we take inspiration from Ken Tobin, who elaborated the metaphor that theories can be seen as lights that we shine on a given moment, with a theory highlighting some parts of a particular context, but as with shining a light, obscuring other parts at the same time. Thus, he advocates for bricolage approaches to research, drawing on different theoretical frameworks, and it is precisely the value of such different lights that we seek to underscore. As different theories and methodologies can each highlight distinct, different features for critical analyses, the value of drawing on diverse theoretical frameworks for highlighting various aspects of science education research becomes even more salient.
And so, with this bricolage of sociocultural perspectives and approaches in our researcher's toolbox, we can begin to view the world around us with diverse lenses on communication. We can pause and consider situations, such as the family shown here, and ask the question, what is communication in this context between these family members? Who communicates in which ways, using which resources, and what are the power relations in this situation? And in this context? And among these dolphins? And in this context with this group of young people? What is communication in each of these very different situations with different actors, and what forms of resources are being used as they communicate with one another or with others that we don't see in these images? These are the types of questions we pose in our research, and for which we draw upon sociocultural critical perspectives to examine the diverse resources people draw upon in communication in general and in science education and meaning-making in particular. The response lies in the theoretical positioning we adopt, and in the methodological lenses we select to view, which will illuminate aspects of language, communication, and resource use in different lights. How does this relate to our research as science educators? If we carry this understanding to our work as science education researchers, it allows us to question what we are able to see and hear with the research lenses that we use, and to interrogate our gaze in ways that brings depth to our research. Next, we take a brief look at an overview of how sociolinguists have looked at language and communication over several research paradigms.
We find it useful to take a step back for a moment and consider different movements in research in sociolinguistics. What you see here on this slide is a very brief, condensed overview of different movements and or paradigms in sociolinguistic research. We want to relate this to our work in science education research and explain each of these three just a bit. Now, please note, this schema does not truly represent how these have taken place in time, in that there's overlaps, they're not distinct necessarily, but they're still helpful in positioning us to think about how are we thinking of communication and resources relative to how people are interacting in science education. And so first at the top, we have the structuralist movement, where patterns and structures in interaction and communication were observed. This was back towards 1900s, possibly before and since, and scientists, sociolinguists, would look at what patterns and what structures are we seeing. Can we break down those patterns and structures into formulas, and what does that tell us about communication amongst people? After this, or following upon this, we have the post-structuralists, who look at communication in context. So one major feature of their work was the recognition that context plays a huge factor, and that when context changes, so does the communication, the resources that are used, and how communication unfolds in interaction. This is then followed by the criticalists, which is where we position our work, where these same ideas are viewed relative to power. Who is able to speak? When? What results does this bring? And what is the context of this socially are important questions that are often asked by critical researchers. And so with this very brief understanding of how sociolinguistic research paradigms might overlap with science education research, we bring to the fore that language and communication are complex, socially situated, contextualized practices. And with this, we use this to select different critical views and lenses to conduct research with students and teachers in different science education contexts. Reflective Pause Part B. B1. Briefly describe your research context. Who is involved? Where? When? What are they doing in general, briefly? If you're not 100% sure, or if you have several contexts, feel free to jot down some notes on all of these. B2. What role does language and communication play in your research? What thoughts do you have? Can you name it? Can you describe the role of communication and language? How would you describe it? And what questions do you have that you can bring with you to our discussion when we meet synchronously?
Part C. Language and Communication, Science Education. In Part C, we highlight a few points relative to the field of science education research. Multilingual, bilingual, monolingual, what does it matter? Well, here we bring attention to the ways that the research field refers to students who are plurilingual, which, in essence, is all of us. Terms such as multilingual, bilingual, and monolingual refer to whole, idealized national language packages, in a sense, meaning that a person who speaks a whole perfect package of a language, such as English, is idealized and considered the norm. From this perspective, these views position the whole perfect speaker as ideal and don't really take into consideration the diverse dynamic ways that speakers enact their communication in context, and it perpetuates deficit views of the learner. In contrast, lenses that position speakers as plurilingual recognize that speakers draw upon multiple diverse resources and that this usage is context-based, is innovative, and allows for research-rich views of speakers, of students, and of teachers. And for this reason, that is why we purposely in our research group position plurilingual speakers in multilingual contexts so that we can honor the resource-rich, diverse, communicative resources that people bring with them when they communicate. Related to this is the concept of linguistic repertoire, which you heard us describe in Part A when we spoke about Sandra's linguistic profile. This concept recognizes the collection of resources a person uses to communicate, which is not bound by national language and does not divide these resources into discrete entities. In the literature, you will find several different definitions for this. This is the current one that we use, and that we feel it allows us to adapt lenses or use lenses in our research that reveals the embodied, the verbal, the contextual, and the material. It is important to point out that there's a contradiction that keeps coming to the fore in science education research and in sociolinguistics. This is the way that multilingualism is viewed step by step versus the enacted diverse ways that plurilingual students and teachers communicate in practice. So what does this mean about science and language? What is science then? What is language through these theoretical perspectives that we adopt? Here we see language and science as an object, if you will. Something to be identified, something that can be seen and heard. But if we are to adapt these more dynamic, plurilingual ways of understanding communication and language, these shift towards becoming processes. Language becomes languaging, science becomes sciencing. We can then ask, what are considered resources for communication and meaning-making in science teaching and learning? Here we show video off-prints from a point at which we co-taught within a classroom with 10 and 11-year-olds at a primary school in Luxembourg. The students had conducted investigations that they designed on condensation and evaporation, and this student and I were having a conversation about what she understood about what had happened and what she thought the relevance was for the shape of the container that they were using. In this situation, we ask you to consider, what resources for communication and meaning making are we using in this context? What do you think? What we saw was that the contextual factors included the science notebook on the table in front of us, our gestures to the diagrams she had drawn, to the narrative that she had written in German, and then to the shapes that we made with our hands after, all contributed to us sharing and discussing her understanding of what had happened and what might possibly be investigated next. So all of these contextual factors contributed to us making meaning in this context at this point in time relative to her understanding. Reflective pause, part C. What views of language and communication are you assuming and drawing upon in your work? We invite you to consider this. How are you positioning science? What is science and what is language in your views that you're adopting and using in your own research? Part D. Making spaces for diverse voices in science education. Research methodologies.
As already introduced, we utilize a critical bricolage approach to our research, and we draw on a range of diverse methodologies, depending on the emergent foci of our studies. The mode of inquiry that we utilize with our team is one of collaboration, as we work together collectively to generate theory, raise questions, explore purposes, and in turn generate new perspectives, implications, and further questions. Our explorations and our understandings of methodologies have emerged through prior studies in which we've utilized a range of reflexive approaches, typically beginning with an event-oriented focus to our often shared inquiring. Critical ethnography, as well as approaches from co-autoethnography, work together with visual ethnographic approaches, and we often draw upon participatory approaches, including co-generative dialogue, co-researching, and co-writing. Much of our work in classrooms is structured as design experiments, as we work with teachers to reflectively deconstruct classroom events with the goal of reconstructing more inclusive and equitable science education practices. And methodologies from the sociology of emotions, such as interaction ritual analysis, are also important to our work. An embodied multimodal interaction analysis supports highlighting the intricacies of children's communication and interactions in science education. The perspectives we bring are grounded in a dialectical understanding to social life, including the relationship between the individual and the collective, and between structure and agency. Grounding our work in an appreciation of the dynamics of these dialectical and reciprocal relations allows us to move towards a mutually beneficial, continually shifting research practice, one which is hopefully relevant and valuable to all participants. We mentioned earlier the notion that theories can serve as lights that both highlight as well as obscure. And Tobin has further written that this perspective underscores that theories can serve to illuminate parts of an otherwise darkened landscape. As theories change, we see things differently, and new data sources may become salient, leading to shifted methodologies for answering the central guiding questions of what is happening and why is it happening, as well as the question of what more is there. These are key questions to consider in working towards transformative practices for science education.
So what might this look like in practice? Next, we provide some examples from research.
The first, examining interaction rituals in student-directed science. This was a study that we conducted in primary schools here in Luxembourg. And the analytical approach drew upon interaction ritual theories, which situates communication in groups through a lens of emotions and interaction on very, very short time scales, 1/10 of a second. What we did was we constructed a case of a plurilingual student named Teo, who was working in a language he was also working to learn, German. So in this classroom, Theo spoke several different national languages out of school and with his family, but in school he was working to learn German and then also to use German when participating in science. We had two main questions that guided the initial research, which were, what is the nature of interaction rituals that formed in small group encounters with Theo? And second, what do these reveal about Theo's participation in science practices and his language use when he was participating in these ways? What we saw when we looked at his body positioning, his gestures, his gaze, where he was looking, and so all of these factors in combination with when he was verbalizing, what happened? And we saw a change over time where in the beginning, in the upper left corner, you'll see him with the small group. They were focusing in the middle on a science investigation about condensation and evaporation. He was positioned much more on the outside, both physically, in verbal exchanges, in developing ideas for the investigations. And you see him in the bottom corner of that square, writing in his science journal off to the side even. He was much more on the periphery. Things were much more serious for him. His emotions were much more dampened, I would say. Over time, over a period of several different units where students were directing the investigations that they were conducting, there was a subtle change to greater synchrony. And we see this here in the screenshot on the bottom lower right, where Theo in the striped shirt could be seen even expressing the exact same facial expressions of joy, of collaboration, of participation with his group mates. And so through this, we saw these key findings. Interaction rituals developed through playfulness and mimicking of gesture, mimicking of body position, mimicking of speech patterns, mimicking of speech exchanges that mediated his participation in science and use of German. Meaning, over time, he was able to pattern his ways of interacting similar to those of his group mates and able to participate more fully. The instruction that was student-centered relative to the teacher-chosen theme of condensation and evaporation created spaces for repeated ritual interaction that he could use to participate in more central ways. He was able to see what it meant to participate in more central ways. This is one example of ways that we have examined and used resource-rich lenses and theoretical positionings that allow us to see how students are interacting while drawing on various communicative resources. A second lens that we use often in our research is an embodied multimodal interaction analysis that draws upon Bakhtinian lenses of discourse and interaction, of dialogic communication among actors in context and over time. And so here we just see two brief snapshots of what types of views this might bring to our work in classrooms. On the left, we see a student bent over working with a beaker. And again, this was examining condensation and evaporation. And she's working with her classmates in an investigation to look at what happens with that condensation over time. When we analyze this later, using the multimodal interaction analysis and looking at the gestures she employed, what she said to a teacher to explain her meaning making over time, we saw that she created very similar gestures to what had happened with the materials in class and the top of a notebook to say, look, it bent like this and the water rolled here and it did this. And so it was only in looking at her gestures and her body in combination with what she was saying to the teacher that we could see what she had gained in that meaning-making process. Whereas if we had simply been looking at the spoken and what she was saying or verbalizing to the teacher, a deficit lens could have been applied and said that she did not gain much, whereas we saw that she truly had a really deep understanding of what was happening.
These are two brief examples that we share from our research to illustrate how research theories and methodologies highlight some aspects of contexts and obscure others. The key is to learn to have insight around our choices as researchers so that we may select purposely and have a deep understanding of what is being illuminated and what is being obscured.
Reflective Pause, Part D. With the methodology and methods you're employing in your research, what is being highlighted? What is being obscured? Next, brainstorm a list of central considerations and/or possible tensions relative to language, communication, or voice in your work.
In conclusion, we hope that in sharing our perspectives and from our research that we have provided you with points to consider in your own work relative to language, communication, diversity, and resources, and thinking about these through lenses that work towards equity in science education. We look forward to talking to you soon.